All right, today we're jumping into a story that honestly changed everything. We're talking about how we see social media, our own privacy, even democracy itself. This is the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
So let's just start with one number to wrap our heads around this. 87 million. That is a huge number, right? Well, that's how many Facebook profiles had their data scraped, and most of them had absolutely no idea it was even happening.
You can imagine this whole thing just exploded. It set off alarms everywhere, from governments to newsrooms, and everyone was asking the same thing. Wait a minute, how on earth did the private data of millions of people get used to try and influence huge elections? And maybe the bigger question is, how did we let this happen?
Okay, so to really get this, we've got to go back to the start. And what's wild is that this whole thing didn't kick off with some sophisticated hacker in a dark room. Nope, it all started with something that sounds, well, kind of harmless. A personality quiz.
So the key player here was this app called This Is Your Digital Life. It was made back in 2013 by a data scientist, Alexander Kogan. And the deal was simple. He'd pay you a little bit of money to take a personality test. And, back then, that was the kind of thing you just click on without a second thought.
But here's the crazy part. Here's how you get from about 270,000 people who actually took the quiz to that staggering 87 million number. The app didn't just grab the quiz taker's data. Because of how Facebook's rules were set up back then, it also reached out and scraped the data from their entire list of friends, just like that.
And this is a really important point. This wasn't a hack like we usually think of one. Cambridge Analytica didn't have to break down any digital walls. They basically just walked right through an unlocked door that Facebook itself had left open. It was a feature, a part of their API, that was just waiting for someone to take advantage of it.
So, okay, they've got all this data, but just having a bunch of likes and birthdays isn't enough, right? That's not a political weapon. Yet. The real trick was figuring out how to turn all those random digital footprints into something that could actually be used to persuade people.
And this gets to the absolute core of their sales pitch. See, most political campaigns look at demographics, your age, where you live, the who you are. But Cambridge Analytica claimed they could go deeper, into psychographics. They weren't just interested in who you were, but why you are the way you are. What are your hopes, your fears, your hidden motivations? That was the promise, anyway.
The tool they used for this was a pretty standard psychological model called the Big Five, or OCEAN. You might have heard of it. And their big flashy claim was that they could take something as simple as your Facebook likes and use it to map out your entire personality, and from there, predict how you'd act.
So now, in theory, they had these detailed psychological profiles for millions of voters. And that's when the data goes from being just data to becoming a political tool. It wasn't about understanding people anymore. The goal was to influence them. This is where it gets transformed into what some people started calling a weapon.
The name of the game was micro-targeting. So forget those generic campaign ads you see on TV that are meant for everybody. The idea here was to send hyper-specific, totally custom-made ads to tiny, tiny groups of people, especially those undecided voters, the ones they called the persuadables. Imagine getting an ad that feels like it was written just for you, hitting on your specific hopes or fears, all based on that personality profile.
And man, this story just took off. It was the central plot in documentaries like The Great Hack, and the narrative was powerful. Data wasn't just information anymore. It was the new oil, the world's most valuable resource, and it could be weaponized to fight these huge political and cultural wars. But here's where this story gets a little more complicated. Just as everyone was getting terrified of this all-powerful mind control machine, a bunch of people, academics, data scientists, even some people on the inside, started to push back. They started asking a very simple question. Hold on, did any of this stuff actually work?
Well, it turns out political science experts pointed to a pretty big hole in the whole theory. All the research shows that your personality type, from that Big Five model, it's actually a terrible predictor of how you're going to vote. We're talking it can only predict about 5% of your political choices. That's not a lot.
And it wasn't just theory. They actually put this thing to the test. During the Ted Cruz primary campaign in 2016, they ran the model, and it was a spectacular failure. In one case, more than half of the voters their system identified as solid Cruz supporters were actually backing somebody else. I mean, it just flat out didn't work. So this brings us to the real mystery at the heart of this whole thing, doesn't it? Was Cambridge Analytica this powerful psychological superweapon? Or was it just really, really good and maybe a little deceptive marketing? The truth, as it turns out, is probably somewhere in the middle, and it's super complicated.
But here's the thing. Whether their tech was revolutionary or just snake oil, it almost doesn't matter. The fallout from the scandal itself was absolutely massive. The shockwaves from this story completely changed our digital world and how we think about the tech companies that are so central to our lives.
And it all happens so fast. You have this little app back in 2013, a news report in 2015 that didn't get a ton of traction, and then bam! March 2018, the whistleblower Christopher Wiley comes forward, and the whole thing just explodes. Just a few weeks later, you've got Mark Zuckerberg himself testifying in front of the US Congress. It was a whirlwind.
And then came the final exclamation point on the whole affair. $5 billion. That was the fine, a record breaker that the Federal Trade Commission hit Facebook with for its massive failures in protecting user privacy.
And at the end of the day, this whole mess basically forced governments around the world to wake up and do something. It was a huge trigger for new privacy laws, and the most famous one is Europe's GDPR. That law really set a brand new standard for how companies have to handle our data and gave us, the users, way more control.
Inside the tech world itself, this scandal lit a fire under the whole issue of data ethics. Suddenly, everyone was talking about things that honestly should have been obvious all along, but just weren't standard practice. Things like being transparent about what you're doing with data, getting real, meaningful consent from people, not just hiding it in the fine print.
And all of this really leaves us with a huge question we all have to think about now. If our data really is the new oil, if it's that valuable, who do you actually trust to protect it? That's the question Cambridge Analytica forced into the open, and it's one we're still trying to answer.